The woman walked into the steakhouse wearing a plain sweater, worn flats, no assistant, no designer bag. No one knew she was one of the loneliest billionaires in America. She ordered a single steak and sat alone. The waiter, a tired-looking single father, left a folded piece of paper on her table. When she opened it, her heart stopped. "Tonight's meal is on me." Why would a stranger, clearly struggling himself, want to pay for her? She stared at the note, her fingers trembling slightly. Something about those 7 words cracked through a wall she had spent years building. 2 hours earlier, Claire Whitmore had stood in front of her bathroom mirror and made a decision. She would go out tonight, not as the founder of Whitmore Capital. Not as the woman whose face occasionally appeared in Forbes with carefully controlled quotes about market disruption. Just as someone hungry for a meal, she didn't have to eat alone in her apartment. She pulled on a gray sweater she'd owned for years, the kind with a small pull near the hem that made it look lived in. Her flats were scuffed at the toes. She left her leather bag on the counter and grabbed an old canvas tote instead. No jewelry except the plain watch her father had given her before he died. In the elevator down from her penthouse, she caught her reflection in the polished steel doors. She looked ordinary, forgettable, exactly what she wanted. The steakhouse sat on a corner 3 blocks from her building, the kind of place she passed every day but never entered. It wasn't the sort of restaurant that required reservations or had a sommelier. The sign out front advertised a weeknight special in block letters. Through the windows, she could see families crowded into booths, couples leaning over shared appetizers, a few solo diners bent over their phones. It looked warm, loud, human. Claire pushed through the door and was immediately hit by the smell of grilled meat and butter. A hostess barely looked up as she grabbed a menu and led Claire to a small table near the back. The vinyl seat squeaked when she sat down. Around her, silverware clinked against plates. Conversations overlapped. Someone laughed too loud at a joke she couldn't hear. No one looked at her twice. She opened the menu and scanned the options. The prices weren't outrageous, but they weren't cheap either. A family of 4 would think twice before ordering appetizers. She found herself doing the same mental math she used to do in college, back when $10 mattered. The ribeye was listed at $38, the filet mignon at $42. She stared at the numbers longer than necessary, not because she couldn't afford it, but because she was remembering what it felt like when she couldn't. Her waiter appeared beside the table without her noticing. He set down a glass of water and pulled out a notepad. Claire looked up and saw a man in his late 30s, with dark hair starting to gray at the temples. His face had the kind of tiredness that didn't come from one bad night. It was the weariness of someone who worked long shifts and woke up early and never quite caught up on sleep. His name tag read, Samuel. "Can I start you off with something to drink?" Samuel asked. His voice was even, professional, the kind of tone that had been practiced over thousands of tables. Claire shook her head. "Just water is fine." Samuel nodded and waited, pen ready. She glanced down at the menu one more time, her eyes landing on the ribeye. It was the most expensive steak on the list. Something about that made her hesitate. She could feel Samuel watching, not impatiently, just observing. When she finally spoke, her voice came out quieter than she intended. "I'll have the ribeye, medium rare. No sides." Samuel wrote it down without comment and took her menu. As he turned to leave, Claire noticed the way his shoulders sagged slightly, like the weight of the notepad was heavier than it should be. She watched him cross the restaurant and disappear through the kitchen doors. Around her, the noise continued. A child dropped a fork. A man asked for extra napkins. A woman laughed at something her date said. Claire sat in the middle of it all and felt completely alone. She pulled out her phone and opened her email out of habit. 300 unread messages, meeting requests, investment proposals, an invitation to speak at a conference in Singapore. She scrolled through them without reading, just watching the subject lines blur together. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Then she locked the phone and set it face down on the table. She didn't want to think about any of it tonight. Samuel returned a few minutes later with a basket of bread. He set it down gently, then refilled her water glass, even though she'd barely touched it. Claire noticed his hands. They were rough, the kind of rough that came from years of physical work. No wedding ring. His nails were trimmed short and clean. When he walked away this time, she saw a small hole in the heel of his shoe. The bread was warm and soft. Claire tore off a piece and ate it slowly, focusing on the taste of butter and salt. Across from her, an older couple shared a slice of cheesecake with 2 forks. At the table to her left, a mother cut up chicken tenders for a little boy who kicked his feet under the chair. Claire tried to remember the last time she'd eaten in a place like this. Not a Michelin-starred restaurant with a tasting menu. Not a private dining room where deals were made over wine that cost more than most people's rent. Just a regular restaurant full of regular people living regular lives. Her steak arrived 20 minutes later. Samuel carried it on a white plate with a sprig of parsley for garnish. He set it down in front of her with the same quiet efficiency, then stepped back. Claire looked at the meal. It was perfectly cooked, the edges charred dark, the center still pink. Steam rose from the meat. It looked good. Simple. Exactly what she'd ordered. "Anything else I can get you?" Samuel asked. Claire shook her head. "No, thank you." Samuel nodded once, then turned to check on another table. Claire picked up her knife and fork and cut into the steak. The first bite was tender, seasoned well, cooked exactly right. She chewed slowly and tried to enjoy it, but the loneliness settled heavier with each passing minute. She hadn't realized how much silence could weigh until she was sitting in a room full of noise with no one to share it with. She was halfway through her meal when she noticed something odd. Samuel had walked past her table 3 times without stopping, not in a hovering way. He wasn't checking if she needed anything or trying to upsell her on dessert. He was just looking. Each time he passed, his eyes would flicker to her face for half a second, then away. It wasn't creepy. It was something else. Recognition, maybe. Or concern. Claire set down her fork and took a sip of water. Her gaze followed Samuel as he moved through the restaurant. He delivered plates, cleared tables, asked about drinks, all with the same calm professionalism. But when he thought no one was watching, his expression changed. The mask slipped just slightly. And underneath was something raw and tired. He looked like a man holding himself together through sheer force of will. She understood that feeling better than she wanted to admit. When Claire finished her steak, she set her silverware across the plate and reached for her canvas tote. She'd brought cash tonight. No credit card with her name embossed in raised letters. No black Amex that drew second glances from servers who knew what it meant. Just bills folded neatly in her wallet. She pulled out enough to cover the meal and started counting it out on the table. That's when she saw the folded piece of paper tucked under the edge of her plate. She hadn't noticed Samuel place it there. He must have done it when he set down her food, sliding it beneath the porcelain so carefully she hadn't felt the movement. Claire glanced around the restaurant. Samuel was at the far end, taking an order from a family with 3 kids. He wasn't looking her way. She picked up the paper and unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, slightly slanted, written in blue ink. 7 words. "Tonight's meal is on me." Claire read it twice, then a 3rd time. Her chest tightened in a way she hadn't expected. She looked across the restaurant again, trying to catch Samuel's eye, but he was already moving toward the kitchen with a tray of empty plates balanced on one arm. She sat there holding the note, her mind racing through possibilities. This had to be a mistake, or maybe some kind of scam. Maybe he thought she was someone else. Maybe he'd confused her table with another. But the note was folded and placed deliberately, and Samuel had been watching her all night. not in a predatory way, in a way that suggested he saw something in her that she thought she'd hidden well. Claire set the note down and stared at it. Around her, the restaurant continued its evening rhythm. Orders were called out. Plates were delivered. Bills were paid. But she couldn't move. She couldn't understand why a man who clearly worked hard for every dollar would offer to pay for a stranger's meal, especially a meal that cost more than most people spent on dinner in a week. She thought about the hole in his shoe, the tired lines around his eyes, the way he moved through the restaurant like someone who'd been on his feet for hours and still had hours to go. This wasn't a wealthy man trying to impress someone. This was someone who could barely afford his own life, choosing to give part of it away. The question that had stopped her heart in the first moment returned with more force now. Why would he do this? What had he seen in her face that made him think she needed saving? Claire picked up the note again and folded it carefully, running her thumb along the crease. She slipped it into her pocket and placed 2 $20 bills on the table, enough to cover her meal and a generous tip. Then she stood and walked toward the front of the restaurant, her canvas tote hanging from one shoulder. She didn't look back at Samuel. She didn't know what she'd say if she did. But as she pushed through the door into the cool night air, she realized something had shifted. That wall she'd spent years building, the one that kept her separate from everyone else, had a crack in it now. Small, but deep. And she didn't know if she wanted to patch it up or let it widen. Claire made it halfway down the block before she stopped walking. Her hand was still in her pocket, fingers wrapped around the folded note. The streetlights cast long shadows across the sidewalk. Behind her, the steakhouse glowed warm through its windows, a square of light and noise in an otherwise quiet street. She stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of 7 words written in blue ink. She turned around and walked back. The hostess looked up in surprise when Claire came through the door again. "Did you forget something?" Claire shook her head and moved past her, scanning the restaurant until she found Samuel. He was at the far end near the kitchen, balancing 3 plates on his arms with practiced ease. She waited by an empty booth, her heart beating harder than it should. This was stupid. She should just leave the extra money and go. But something about the note wouldn't let her walk away without understanding. Samuel delivered the plates to a table of businessmen, then turned and saw her standing there. His expression shifted, something like concern crossing his face. He made his way through the tables toward her, moving carefully around chairs and children's high chairs. When he reached her, he kept a professional distance, his voice low enough that nearby diners wouldn't hear. "Is everything all right? Was there a problem with your meal?" Claire pulled the note from her pocket and held it up between them. Samuel's eyes dropped to it, then back to her face. She watched him closely, looking for any sign of deception or mockery. She found neither. "Why did you do this?" Claire asked. Her voice came out harder than she meant it to, defensive in a way that surprised even her. Samuel glanced around the restaurant, then gestured toward the empty booth beside them. "Can we talk for a minute?" Claire slid into the booth. Samuel sat across from her, his hands resting on the table. Up close, she could see the exhaustion etched deeper into his face. There were small scars on his knuckles, the kind you got from years of kitchen work and manual labor. His uniform shirt was pressed, but worn thin at the collar. Everything about him spoke of someone holding on tight to something fragile. "I didn't mean to offend you," Samuel said carefully. He looked at her directly, his gaze steady. "I just thought you might need it." Claire felt her defenses rise higher. "What made you think I needed anything?" Samuel was quiet for a moment, choosing his words. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but honest. "I've seen that look before. The way you kept checking the menu prices. The way you ordered the most expensive thing but nothing else. Like you were trying to prove something to yourself." Claire's jaw tightened. "You thought I was poor?" "No," Samuel said, and there was no hesitation in his answer. "I thought you were alone." The words hit harder than Claire expected. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. Across the restaurant, someone dropped a glass, and it shattered on the floor. A server rushed over with a broom. The moment gave Claire time to collect herself, to rebuild the wall that Samuel's observation had cracked even wider. "I can pay for my own meal," she said finally. Her voice controlled again. "I left money on the table." Samuel nodded. "I'm sure you can. That's not why I did it." Claire leaned forward slightly, her fingers lacing together on the table. "Then why? You don't know me. You don't know anything about me." Samuel's expression softened in a way that made him look even more tired. "I know what it's like to sit in a crowded room and feel completely invisible. I know what it's like to go through the motions of living while feeling like you're just watching everyone else actually do it." He looked down at his hands. "I see that look in the mirror every morning. I saw it on your face tonight." The honesty in his words caught Claire off guard. She'd expected excuses or explanations that would let her dismiss this entire interaction. Instead, she was faced with someone who'd seen through the careful disguise she wore, not to her wealth, but to something more fundamental: her loneliness. "So you decided to pay for my dinner," Claire said, and she couldn't keep the edge out of her voice. "Some kind of charity case?" "No." Samuel's response was immediate and firm. "I did it because sometimes, when you're drowning, even a small gesture from a stranger can remind you that you're still human, that you still matter to someone, even if it's just a waiter you'll never see again." Claire stared at him. The restaurant noise faded into background static. She wanted to argue with him, to tell him he was wrong about her, that she wasn't drowning or invisible or any of the things he'd described. But the words wouldn't come because they would have been lies. And something about Samuel made lying feel impossible. "I don't need saving," she said quietly. Samuel's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Neither do I. But we both need to remember we're worth saving. There's a difference." Before Claire could respond, a sharp voice cut through the restaurant. "Brooks, my office. Now." Claire turned to see a man in a button-down shirt and tie, standing near the kitchen, his arms crossed over his chest. He had the look of someone in management, the kind of person who spent more time behind a desk than on the floor. His face was flushed red, anger radiating from him in visible waves. Samuel's entire body tensed. "That's my manager," Samuel said under his breath. He stood slowly, his jaw set. "I need to go." Claire watched him walk across the restaurant. His shoulders squared, despite the obvious tension in his movements. The manager didn't wait for Samuel to reach him. He turned and disappeared through a door marked "Staff Only," leaving it open just enough that Claire could hear raised voices. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was clear. Samuel was getting torn apart. Around her, other diners had noticed the commotion. A woman at the next table whispered something to her husband. Two servers exchanged glances near the bar. The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Claire felt her stomach drop as realization settled in. Someone had seen Samuel leave the note. Someone had reported him. The staff door opened, and the manager emerged first, his face still red. Samuel followed a few steps behind, his expression carefully blank. The manager pointed at him, his voice loud enough now that half the restaurant could hear. "This is your last warning, Brooks. You pull something like that again, you're done. I don't care what sob story you've got. We don't give away free meals here." Samuel said nothing. He just nodded once, his hands hanging at his sides. The manager stormed back toward his office, leaving Samuel standing alone in the middle of the restaurant. Every eye was on him. The humiliation was public and deliberate. Claire felt a surge of anger rise in her chest, not at Samuel, but at the situation she'd inadvertently caused. Samuel caught her looking, and something passed between them. Not quite an apology, but an acknowledgement. Then he turned and went back to work, picking up an empty tray and moving toward a table that needed clearing. He acted like nothing had happened, but Claire could see the weight of it in the set of his shoulders, in the way his movements were just slightly slower than before. Claire sat in the booth for another minute, her mind racing. She thought about the note still in her pocket. She thought about Samuel's words about drowning and mattering and being worth saving. She thought about the hole in his shoe, and the tiredness in his eyes, and the fact that he'd risked his job to offer her one moment of kindness. The math was brutal and simple. He'd tried to help her, and it had cost him something he couldn't afford to lose. She pulled out her wallet and counted out bills, enough to cover her meal, enough for a tip. Then she added more. Much more. She placed the stack on the table, anchored it with the salt shaker so it wouldn't blow away, and stood up. Her hand hovered over the money for a second. Then she pulled one bill back. Instead, she took out a pen from her tote and wrote 3 words on a napkin. "Thank you. Please don't." She left the napkin on top of the stack and walked out of the restaurant for the second time that night. This time, she didn't look back. The walk home felt longer than it should have. Claire's mind kept replaying the conversation, turning Samuel's words over like stones. He'd seen her. Not the version she showed the world. Not the billionaire or the founder or the face in Forbes. He'd seen the person underneath, the one who was tired and lonely and going through the motions, and instead of ignoring it like everyone else did, he'd tried to do something about it. Back in her apartment, Claire stood in her living room and looked around at the space she'd bought 3 years ago. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, minimalist furniture chosen by an interior designer she'd hired and never met. Art on the walls that cost more than most people's cars. Everything was perfect and expensive and completely soulless. She lived here, but it wasn't a home. It was just another place she occupied alone. She pulled the note from her pocket and read it again. The handwriting looked different now, less like a stranger's words and more like a message she'd been waiting for without knowing it. She set it on her kitchen counter and stared at it for a long time, trying to understand what she was feeling. Guilt, certainly. Gratitude, maybe. But underneath both was something sharper. The realization that she'd become so isolated from normal human connection that a simple act of kindness from a struggling waiter had cracked through her defenses more effectively than years of therapy ever had. Her phone buzzed with a notification. Another email, another meeting request, another piece of her life that required her attention and gave nothing back. Claire ignored it and looked out the window at the city below. Somewhere out there, Samuel was finishing his shift, probably worrying about whether he still had a job tomorrow. Probably going home to a kid who needed things he couldn't quite afford. Probably lying awake, wondering if his one moment of humanity had cost him everything. The next morning, Claire woke up thinking about the restaurant. She went through her usual routine on autopilot. Coffee, shower. The business section of 3 different newspapers, conference calls with London and Hong Kong, emails that required decisions worth millions of dollars. All of it felt hollow in a way it hadn't before. Or maybe it had always felt hollow, and she'd just gotten better at ignoring it. At 11, she canceled her afternoon meetings and left her apartment. The steakhouse didn't open until 5 for dinner service, but Claire knew restaurants. The staff came in hours early to prep. She walked the 3 blocks and tried the front door. Locked. She knocked and waited. After a minute, someone appeared on the other side of the glass. A young woman in a server's uniform, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She pointed at the closed sign and mouthed the word. Claire knocked again, harder this time. The woman frowned but unlocked the door and opened it a crack. "We're not open yet. Dinner starts at 5. "I need to speak with your manager," Claire said. Her voice had the tone she used in boardrooms, The one that made people stop arguing and start listening. The woman's eyes widened slightly. Is there a problem? Just get him, please. The woman disappeared into the restaurant. Claire waited outside, the morning sun warm on her shoulders. A few minutes later, the same manager from last night appeared. He looked less angry in daylight, more annoyed than anything else. He stepped outside and let the door close behind him. Can I help you? Claire met his eyes directly. The waiter last night, Samuel Brooks. What happened to him? The manager's expression hardened. That's not really your concern. I'm making it my concern, Claire said. Did you fire him? The manager crossed his arms. I don't discuss personnel matters with customers. Claire took a breath and made a decision. She reached into her bag and pulled out a business card. Not the personal one she gave to friends, the official one, embossed with her company logo and title. She handed it to him and watched his face change as he read it. The color drained slightly, his arms uncrossed. Ms. Whitmore, he said, and his voice had lost all its edge. I didn't realize. I'm sorry, Samuel Brooks, Claire repeated. What happened to him? The manager looked down at the card, then back at her. He's on his final warning. One more incident and he's terminated. He tried to pay for my meal, Claire said, as a kindness. That's not worth firing someone over? The manager's jaw tightened. With all due respect, we have policies. If I let one person give away food, everyone will want to do it. It's a slippery slope. Claire studied him for a moment. She thought about all the times she'd made difficult decisions, the times she'd had to weigh policy against humanity and chose the option that protected the bottom line. She'd always told herself it was necessary. Smart business. But standing here now, looking at this man who was about to ruin someone's life over $42, she felt something shift inside her. How much does Samuel make in a year? Claire asked. The manager blinked. I'm sorry? His salary, how much? I can't disclose that. Claire pulled out her phone and opened her banking app. Ballpark, 30,000. 40? The manager shifted uncomfortably. Around 35, with tips. Claire nodded and started typing. I'm transferring money to your restaurant's account right now. $5,000. That should more than cover any losses from last night and give you a buffer for future acts of human decency from your staff. She looked up at him. Samuel keeps his job. The warning gets removed from his file, and you find a way to tell your employees that kindness isn't a fireable offense. The manager stared at her. Ms. Whitmore, that's very generous, but it's not generous, Claire interrupted. It's the bare minimum. That man risked something valuable to offer a stranger a moment of grace. If you punish him for it, you're teaching everyone who works here that caring about people is bad business. Is that really the lesson you want to pass on? The manager was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he nodded slowly. I'll take care of it. Good. Claire tucked her phone away. And one more thing. Samuel doesn't need to know about this conversation or the money. As far as he's concerned, you just decided to give him another chance. Understood? The manager nodded again. Claire turned and walked away before he could say anything else. Her heart was beating fast, adrenaline coursing through her system like she'd just closed a major deal. But this felt different. This wasn't about money, or power, or winning. This was about making sure one person who'd done something good didn't get destroyed for it. She made it back to her building before she realized she was smiling, not the practiced smile she used in photographs or meetings. A real one that reached her eyes and made her face feel strange because it had been so long since she'd worn it. Claire didn't go back to the steakhouse that night, or the night after. She told herself it was because she didn't want to complicate things further, didn't want Samuel to feel awkward or obligated. But the truth was simpler and harder to admit. She was afraid that if she went back, he'd see through her again. afraid that the moment of connection they'd shared would evaporate under the weight of real conversation. Afraid that she'd have to explain who she really was and watch his expression change the way everyone's expression changed when they found out. Instead, she carried his note with her. It stayed in her pocket during board meetings, during conference calls with investors, during the endless stream of dinners and events that filled her calendar. She'd pull it out sometimes when she was alone and read those 7 words like they were instructions for something she'd forgotten how to do. Each time, she felt that crack in her wall widen a little more. 3 days after her conversation with the manager, Claire found herself walking past the steakhouse again. It was early evening, the dinner rush just beginning. Through the windows, she could see families settling into booths, servers moving between tables, with practiced efficiency. She slowed her pace, searching the dining room for a familiar figure. There. Samuel, carrying a tray of drinks, his movements steady and sure. He was still there, still working. The relief that flooded through her was stronger than it should have been. She kept walking. But something had shifted. The possibility that had been building in her chest for 3 days crystallized into a decision. She would go back. Not tonight, but soon. And this time, she would be honest with him. Not about the money or the intervention with his manager, but about the loneliness, about the crack in her wall, about the fact that his small act of kindness had changed something fundamental in the way she saw herself. That night, Claire sat at her desk in her home office and did something she hadn't done in years. She wrote by hand. The words came slowly at first, then faster as she found her rhythm. She wrote about what it felt like to have everything and still feel empty. She wrote about the difference between being alone and being lonely. She wrote about a waiter who'd seen past her disguise to the human being underneath. When she finished, she read it over once, then folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her wallet. The next evening, Claire walked into the steakhouse wearing the same gray sweater and worn flats. The hostess recognized her this time and smiled. "Welcome back. Table for 1. Claire nodded. The hostess led her to a different table, near the window this time. Claire sat down and watched the street outside, the blur of people passing by on their way to somewhere else. She felt nervous in a way she hadn't felt in years, not since she'd pitched her company to her first investors and knew everything depended on what happened in the next hour. Samuel appeared at her table, and she looked up to find him staring at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Surprise, maybe. Or caution. He set down a glass of water and pulled out his notepad, the gesture so familiar it felt like coming home. "Back again," Samuel said. His voice was neutral, but there was a question underneath it. Claire met his eyes. "I am." Samuel waited, pen hovering over his pad. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable, but weighted with things unsaid. Finally, Claire spoke. "I wanted to apologize. For the other night. For what happened with your manager." Something flickered across Samuel's face. "That wasn't your fault." "It was," Claire said quietly. "You tried to do something kind, and it backfired because of me. I'm sorry." Samuel shook his head slowly. "I knew what I was risking when I left that note. You don't need to apologize for my choices." He looked at her more closely, his expression softening. "But thank you." The words hung in the air between them. Claire felt the nervous energy in her chest settle slightly. This was why she'd come back. Not to fix what happened, but to acknowledge it. To treat this connection as something real instead of pretending it had never existed. "Can I ask you something?" Claire said. Samuel nodded. "Why did you really do it?" "The note. Paying for my meal. You said I looked lonely, but that's not the whole reason, is it?" Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Around them, the restaurant hummed with life. but their table felt separate from it, like they existed in a small pocket of stillness. When he finally spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "I have a daughter. She's 7. Smart as hell, funny, everything you'd want in a kid." He looked down at his notepad, then back at her. Her mom left when she was 2. Said she couldn't handle being a parent, couldn't handle the responsibility. Just walked out one day and never came back. He took a breath. "I've spent 5 years doing everything I can to make sure my daughter knows she matters, that she's loved, that she's worth the effort it takes to show up every single day." Claire felt something tighten in her chest. Samuel continued, his words careful but honest. "When I saw you sitting there alone, looking at that menu like you were trying to convince yourself you deserved to order what you wanted, I saw my daughter 30 years from now. I saw someone who'd forgotten they mattered. And I thought, if I could do one thing to remind you that you're worth showing up for, even if it's just a free meal from a stranger, then maybe that means when my daughter grows up and feels that same loneliness, someone will do the same for her." The restaurant noise faded to nothing. Claire sat across from Samuel and felt tears prick the corners of her eyes. She blinked them back, but not before he saw. He didn't look away or apologize. He just gave her space to feel what she was feeling. "I don't know what to say to that," Claire said finally, her voice rough. Samuel's mouth curved into a small, genuine smile. "You don't have to say anything. You came back. That's enough." Claire reached into her wallet and pulled out the folded paper she'd written the night before. She held it for a second, then set it on the table between them. "I wrote this for you. You don't have to read it now. Or ever, if you don't want to. But I wanted you to have it." Samuel looked at the paper, then at her. "What is it?" "The truth," Claire said simply. "About who I am, and what your kindness meant to me." Samuel picked up the paper and tucked it into his apron pocket without unfolding it. The gesture felt like a promise. He would read it later, in private, and whatever he found there would stay between them. Claire felt the tightness in her chest ease completely. "So," Samuel said, his tone shifting back to something lighter. "What can I get you tonight?" Claire smiled, a real smile that felt foreign on her face. "Surprise me." Samuel raised an eyebrow. "That's a lot of trust to put in a waiter you barely know." "Maybe," Claire said, "but you've earned it." Samuel nodded once, then walked away. Claire watched him go, feeling something she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember. Not happiness exactly, but possibility. The sense that maybe she didn't have to live her entire life behind walls. That maybe connection was still possible, even for someone who'd spent years believing she didn't deserve it. Samuel returned 20 minutes later with a plate she hadn't ordered. Grilled salmon with roasted vegetables and a side of garlic bread. Simple, well-made, the kind of meal someone would cook for a friend. He set it down in front of her without ceremony. "On the house," he said, before she could protest. "And before you argue, this one's official." Manager approved it himself. Said something about goodwill gestures being good for business. Claire looked up at him sharply. Samuel's expression was innocent, but there was a knowing glint in his eyes. He knew, maybe not all of it, but enough. She'd underestimated him, thinking she could intervene without him finding out. The realization should have embarrassed her, but instead, it made her laugh. A real laugh that came from somewhere deep she'd forgotten existed. "Thank you," she said, and the words carried more weight than they should have. Samuel nodded. "Enjoy your meal. I'll check back in a bit." Claire ate slowly, savoring each bite, not because the food was extraordinary, but because it felt like the first meal she'd eaten in years that wasn't weighed down by loneliness. Around her, the restaurant continued its evening rhythm. Families laughed. Couples held hands across tables. Solo diners scrolled through phones or read books. everyone living their lives, and for the first time in longer than she could remember. Claire felt like she was part of it instead of just observing from the outside. When she finished, she left cash on the table for a tip. More than the meal was worth, but less than she would have left a week ago. She was learning the balance between generosity and condescension, between helping and interfering. It was harder than she'd thought it would be. She stood to leave and saw Samuel clearing a nearby table. He looked up and caught her eye. No words passed between them, but understanding did. This wasn't goodbye. It was the beginning of something neither of them had expected, but both needed. A connection built on honesty and kindness, and the shared recognition that loneliness didn't have to be permanent. Claire walked out into the night air, her canvas tote on her shoulder, her gray sweater soft against her skin. The city moved around her, thousands of people going about their lives, and she felt part of it instead of separate from it. The crack in her wall had widened into something that couldn't be sealed back up, and for the first time since she could remember, she didn't want to seal it. 3 blocks away, in her apartment with its floor-to-ceiling windows and expensive art, her phone would be lighting up with notifications, meetings to schedule, deals to close, a life that demanded her constant attention and gave nothing back. But tonight, walking slowly through streets filled with strangers, who might not be strangers if she let them close enough, Claire made a different choice. She took the long way home. And when she finally reached her building, she didn't look at her phone. Instead, she looked at the folded note still in her pocket. Samuel's handwriting visible through the thin paper. 7 words that had changed everything. Sometimes the things that save us aren't grand gestures or life-changing events. Sometimes they're just small acts of kindness from people who understand what it means to need saving. And sometimes, if we're lucky, we remember to pass that kindness forward.